when blood sugar drops, that's an energy crisis, right? We don't have enough of that reserve, enough of that fuel to draw from. And because of that, the body has these backup mechanisms. If we didn't have those, we all be dead. And, when we have these backup mechanisms, that ultimately keeps us alive because these stress hormones allow us to make carbohydrates from the stored fuel that we have in our bodies. So they almost in a way break down our body to fuel ourselves during these energy crises. So it will break down first, liver glycogen if we do have any, and liver glycogen is basically stored carbohydrates that we have or should have. But, say, for example, we're eating more of a lower carb diet for a long period of time. We might not have those available glycogen stores to draw from. And as a result, the body looks at the next best thing. So the next best thing might be breaking down body proteins or body fats to ultimately convert pieces of those into carbohydrates to raise that blood sugar back up. The problem with that is we're breaking down lean muscle and we're breaking down ourselves to ultimately fuel us throughout the day. And what ends up happening is you start losing, some muscle tissue, right? And you start breaking down these fats, which over time, if that is carried out more chronically, we know that high amounts of fat in the blood can ultimately disrupt our ability to tolerate carbs.
Welcome to The Body Never Lies. I'm your host, Leela Lutz. Each week, myself and experts from around the world help you uncover the secret ways your body communicates with you to empower you in your own individual health journey. So once upon a time, type 1 diabetes was known as something you were born with or developed as an infant or a young child. And type 2 diabetes was known as being the one you developed from being overweight, living the high-fat, high-sugar, processed food and sedentary lifestyle. But I'm seeing more and more that these are not the norms anymore. I have clients who don't eat bad food and are pre-diabetic. And I have clients with chronic blood sugar handling issues that have a myriad of health issues, and all that's being prescribed to them is metformin. And as my guest will tell you, there are more and more young adults being diagnosed with type 1 later in life. My guest today, Isaac Pohlman, has a degree in Physiology, a Master's in Nutritional Science, and is a Registered Dietitian. But he also has type 1 diabetes and in the past had hypothyroidism, both of which he developed in college. Today I want to ask him about his work specialising in people with blood sugar handling issues and insulin resistance, i.e. some people have these issues and don't have diabetes, and we're going to talk about that, why it's happening and what we can do about it rather than cutting out entire food groups from our diet and going on drugs that just cascade into needing more and more drugs. Oh, I'm so excited, Isaac Pohlman, to have you on the show today to talk all things diabetes, type 1, type 2, insulin resistance, all that stuff. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, I really appreciate the invite, Layla. It's wonderful to be on with you here.
So let's start. I want to start a little bit about your journey because you have an interesting story, right? Because you yourself you're an amazing coach, but you also have type 1 diabetes.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I can kind of delve into my story because it didn't really necessarily start with diabetes for me. And started really early in high school, actually, where I was as an athlete in high school and kind of was accustomed to really working out hard, training hard, and that really got the best of me, as maybe a lot of people here can understand or relate to if you've been involved with sports. And at that time, I really was overdoing it, overtraining, and that led to a lot of symptoms for me: chronic fatigue, gastroparesis, and was something that really took place very early for me, and I didn't really get a lot of guidance for it early on. So it was kind of this overwhelming experience where I really didn't know what to do with it. And that kind of existed until college, where it got even worse because I was playing varsity soccer in college as well, and ended up having to quit, actually, because of some of those debilitating symptoms. And at that time, too, was an identity loss for me because I so much resonated with being an athlete and playing soccer. But I really had to make that switch because I really wasn't supporting my health in the best way possible. And while the doctors I met with, and I met with numerous of them, I can't even count on how many I met with, they they really weren't the best resource for me. And while well-meaning, I just really, at that time, I understood I needed to take it into my own hands and really advocate for myself, and started to really dive in. And the more and more I got into it, the more curious I got. And while that was a really difficult time frame for me, I think it really formed the foundation of how I work with clients to this day, right? And at that point, too, another kind of wrench got thrown into it where I got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So that was in addition to the fatigue and all the hormonal imbalances that I was kind of working through. That was just kind of another sort of wrench thrown in that I was trying to navigate on my own there. So yeah, I got introduced to it early, and there are obstacles, challenges, but it really formed the way I practice and work with people to this day.
And how about your coaching journey as your professional journey? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I actually went on to after my undergrad experience, which was very much rooted in human physiology, which is like a degree that you can use for like medical school or physical therapy, physician's assistant, that kind of thing. So I had that foundation of, hey, how the body works here. And then I went on to graduate school where I really studied nutritional sciences, more specialized, and at the University of Michigan. So really worked on that, learning more about macronutrients and micronutrients and impact on the body. And, after that training, I went on to get my license as a dietitian as well. Went through this kind of year-long internship, similar to kind of like what a doctor would do with like a residency, just a little bit shorter. That was something I took pride in, but I think one of the more things that I actually thought was really helpful for me was the self-discovery, independent research, reading up on books, things like from Ray Peat, Broda Barnes, and then actually getting mentorship with a friend, colleague that I continue to chat with today by the name of Josh Rubin. I think you're familiar with him as well. He's been a great resource for me, and I actually worked with him for a good solid year during that time too, where I was trying to navigate that on my own, and just felt like his mentorship was super helpful when it came to me ultimately feeling better. So that was a big thing for me, getting mentorship, reading self-discovery trainings, and really experimenting on myself, which allowed me to really help and support clients that I work with to this day, which tend to be those that are dealing with some level of blood sugar issue, whether that be individuals with type 1 diabetes, type 2 prediabetes, insulin resistance, that kind of thing. So yeah, that self-discovery mentorship really played a huge role for me.
Something I can't really stress enough to coaches, and I always think the best coaches and have walked the path of being the client, because it's one thing to like do something for yourself and learn something yourself and apply it to yourself and then put that out as a package for client stuff, but to actually be coached by someone else and have to show up every day with your food logs and your temps and pulse and all that sort of stuff, you really gain a wisdom that you wouldn't get otherwise for your practice. So I really encourage all coaches to go and get coaching by someone else. And I think that really makes you a great coach, is having that experience of being the client. So, yeah, Josh is amazing. He's been on the show a few times before. If you guys want to go back and listen to his episodes, a great mentor of mine as well. But let's get into diabetes. So, like you say, you work with all areas of diabetes. So for everyone listening, we're going to cover all the blood sugar handling issues. So you're going to love this episode if you've been told you're pre-diabetic, you're type 1, type 2, or you have blood sugar handling issues. Just in general, you're going to really like this episode. So I guess I want to start with what is diabetes?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. What is diabetes? Well, when it comes to any sort of diabetes, wherever that spectrum falls for you, whether that's type 1, type 2, or, they have a spectrum now where they call it like late onset diabetes as well. But if we kind of stick with the main categories, type 1, type 2, it's more so an inability to process carbohydrates. And a lot of times we're thinking of, oh, well, it's the carbs that are the problem. And to some extent that could be the case, but but there's always some underlying reasons as to why we're not able to properly use and take in carbohydrates as fuel, right? It can be for type 1, maybe it's an insulin deficiency issue, or maybe it's things like a lack of sleep, or excess stress, or lack of movement, or high fat diets, which really underlie our ability to ultimately process those carbohydrates and turn them into fuel. So at the core of diabetes, no matter where you kind of fall in that spectrum, it's just that inability to use those carbohydrates for fuel. And it's not just about the carbs, it's about some of those underlying factors like the macro micronutrient balance, as well as lifestyle factors as well.
Okay, cool. And then so was a really good cover of that. So what would be, I guess, how we explain blood sugar handling to people? Because I think people think of like, oh, you just test your blood sugars and whether your blood sugar is good or not. It's quite a loose term. I'd love you to explain that a bit more in depth.
Yeah. And I always like to explain like blood sugar balance or blood sugar handling kind of like this. So if you think about like a car, and a car's primary energy source, at least, some of the cars these days are fueled with gas, right? That's their primary fuel source. And that's kind of the same thing for blood sugar. It's this resource that we pull from to ultimately feel our best. And when that is disrupted, it's almost in a sense a threat to our survival, just as if we didn't have enough gas in our car, we wouldn't be able to get from point A to point B, right? So when we don't have that balanced blood sugar, what ends up happening is it's a threat to our body. It's a threat to our survival, because if blood sugar tanks and it's at a zero, we're dead. We're not alive. We're not living. So anytime that's disrupted, whether it goes too high or whether it goes too low, that can be a threat to our survival, and that can increase stress hormones in a way. And when stress increases, especially if this is more of a chronic nature, symptoms tend to come about. So I like to also give the example of, if the audience has seen like the Snickers commercials, they often say, hey, you're not you when you're hungry. Well, that's kind of the same thing for blood sugar. You're also not you when your blood sugar is out of balance, right? When it's too low, you tend to feel more dizzy, more lightheaded, irritable, hangry types of feelings, anxious. Versus if your blood sugar is high, you tend to feel a little bit more lethargic, excess thirst, frequent urination, numbness, tingling, itchy skin. So there's a lot of things that go into blood sugar balance that not always can be measured by with blood sugar, but also with symptoms, and are not just specific for those with diabetes. Balancing blood sugar can play a big role when it comes to any person. And whenever that blood sugar is in more balance, you're going to feel better. You're going to be feeling better mentally and physically, more lasting energy. You're going to be in a better mood. You're going to be able to handle stress a lot better. You're going to be more resilient, less food cravings as well. So just feeling better overall when that is imbalanced, because we are energy beings and because that is such a primary fuel source that our body functions on.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think we're so conditioned to not eat, because eating can make, food equals weight gain. So if you are not eating, you're not gaining weight. So that's okay. And then not understanding that when you're not eating, your blood sugar drops and how bad that is for your health. And then what goes down must come up, right? So
exactly.
What happens in terms of stress hormones when our blood sugar drops too low? Because I'm seeing more and more people living on constant low blood sugar. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What happens when your blood sugar drops too low? What's the physiological response in terms of stress hormones and things?
Yeah. So when the blood sugar drops low, and typically low would be defined as less than 70, if you're monitoring from an American standpoint. So when blood sugar drops, that's an energy crisis, right? We don't have enough of that reserve, enough of that fuel to draw from. And because of that, the body has these backup mechanisms. If we didn't have those, we all be dead. And when we have these backup mechanisms, that ultimately keeps us alive because these stress hormones allow us to make carbohydrates from the stored fuel that we have in our bodies. So they almost in a way break down our body to fuel ourselves during these energy crises. So it will break down first, liver glycogen if we do have any, and liver glycogen is basically stored carbohydrates that we have or should have. But, say for example, we're eating more of a lower carb diet for a long period of time, we might not have those available glycogen stores to draw from. And as a result, the body looks at the next best thing. So the next best thing might be breaking down body proteins or body fats to ultimately convert pieces of those into carbohydrates to raise that blood sugar back up. The problem with that is we're breaking down lean muscle and we're breaking down ourselves to ultimately fuel us throughout the day. And what ends up happening is you start losing, some muscle tissue, right? And you start breaking down these fats, which over time, if that is carried out more chronically, we know that high amounts of fat in the blood can ultimately disrupt our ability to tolerate carbs. So what I find in working with people, I get a lot of folks that are coming from this lower carb ketogenic background, yet their blood sugars are continuing to rise. And that's part of the issue, is that they're breaking down a lot of these fats that are ultimately contributing to some level of insulin resistance. And it's making it harder to ultimately process those carbohydrates.
And you become like carbohydrate intolerant, don't you? So when you reintroduce carbs after being low carb, can you explain a little bit? Because a lot of these people go, but no, I tried some carbs and now I feel awful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep. And this is one of the mistakes that I actually made too, going back to my health history and many of the clients that I see is going too fast, right? It's all about practice. And if you were to even look at a profession outside of just nutrition, if you were wanting to become a basketball player, you wouldn't say, hey, I'm going to play high school basketball and all the way jump to the NBA. I mean, there's some people that can do that, but not for the good percentage. And that's the same thing when it comes to carbohydrates. We think that, hey, we're going to eat lower carb and go all the way up to moderate carb, or I'll go all the way up to high carb. And what ends up happening, while that might be supportive in the long run, that's probably not supportive where you are. So it's all about meeting yourself where you are right now, because you just don't have that mineral balance in place. You don't have that machinery. Your body's not used to practicing in that sort of manner with carbohydrates that you do have on board, because it's been so used to getting proteins and fats for fuel, right? So it takes a period of time of adjustment, and it's all about meeting you where you are. So if you are eating ketogenic diet, maybe it's adding 1 carb per day, right? It's not going, oh, I'm going to have a moderate carb diet or high carb diet. That's just kind of asking for a lot of symptoms to develop. And I see that happening for those that are really struggling with that. They just kind of tend to go too fast. Or, they might not be eating the ultimately the supportive carbs there for you, because ultimately there's a difference between something like, a bowl of cereal or oatmeal or rice versus fruit or root veggies or squash, right? There's differences between those carbohydrate sources that can ultimately make the difference in how you feel.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that part when we get specific with the food. But I think this is also why a lot of people say they put on a lot of weight when they, stop these low carb diets and move to what we would call a pro-metabolic kind of way of eating. They're putting on lots and lots of weight from going too fast and just all of a sudden eating a lot more calories than they used to eat. And then we have insulin. So can you explain insulin to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So insulin kind of goes hand in hand with blood sugar. So whenever we eat something, and it can be lower in carbs too, but whenever we eat something, there is some semblance of insulin release. With the exception of someone with like type 1 diabetes who just doesn't have that ability to do so. But with that being an exception, for the rest of those that don't have type 1 or don't have that insulin deficiency, insulin is released ultimately whenever you are eating something, and particularly in response to carbohydrates. So the body senses when blood sugar is rising, and the adapting machine that it is, it adjusts, it secretes more insulin to ultimately keep that blood sugar within balance. So ultimately we're feeling as well as possible, right? And what that insulin does is it takes those carbohydrates from the bloodstream, right? And it delivers them to the cells. So ultimately we can use and create energy out of them. And that's a big reason why when blood sugar imbalances occur, when we're not able to take those carbohydrates from the bloodstream to the cells, that a lot of us might experience some energy issues because we're just not getting that proper fuel. And carbohydrates being the prime fuel source for the body, you can imagine how that could create some fatigue, some energy issues there too, especially for those that are maybe experiencing the blood sugar imbalances or just not eating carbs in general.
So we can have trouble with insulin resistance in all types of people, not just diabetics. Would you explain insulin resistance to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to insulin resistance, and it's kind of like a two-part process, if you will. So we know there's kind of an initial period of time where maybe blood sugar rises a bit, and those can be due to maybe some lifestyle factors. And typically it's not just one thing, there's all sorts of things that could contribute to some higher blood sugars there. But let's say, could be sleep. So you're not getting enough sleep. Maybe you're experiencing a lot of stress at work or at home. Maybe you're not moving in a way that you'd like to, maybe have a desk job and ultimately not getting enough of that movement. And maybe your diet is a little bit imbalanced. So maybe you're consuming, a lot of, excess carbohydrates, maybe not enough protein, maybe not enough of the supportive fats, and blood sugar rises, right? And what happens as a result of blood sugar rising is that we secrete more of that insulin, right? To kind of keep things in balance. Again, going back to that blood sugar balance theme. And when that happens, let's say these patterns continue over the course of time. Well, if those really continue, blood sugar is continue going to rise, and as a result, insulin is going to be released as a result of that. And when that becomes more and more chronic, and insulin can rise, out of range. And what typically happens is when insulin rises out of range and we get too much, in a way, it overwhelms the cell and it doesn't respond in the same way. In other words, it kind of desensitizes it. And as a result, the insulin that we once were able to utilize properly and help us to kind of regulate that blood sugar, it all of a sudden doesn't work as well. And as a result, that blood sugar tends to rise. And over time, that can contribute to some prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, for example, right? But in those initial periods, we have a lot of insulin going around. So for some people, that can lead to lower blood sugars, actually, some hypoglycemia. And then as that progresses, more of that insulin resistance, we're not just able to utilize that because the cell is so overwhelmed with the amount of insulin that is available. And you can see that with almost any other hormone too. If you talk about thyroid hormone as well, if we have too much thyroid hormone going around, there's something called thyroid resistance. So, there's hormone resistance where we're just not able to use it properly. And that's what typically leads to that insulin resistance that we talk about there.
And that can be an interesting one with blood tests, right? Because you can, for instance, have a lot of thyroid in your blood and it come under the normal guise of blood tests, but then told you don't have a thyroid problem, but then you have all of these symptoms. And it's the things that we can't test, like what's happening at the cell level. And we had another episode with Tomo on that one about blood tests and how we need to use them. So I'm glad you brought that up. So then how do we test? Well, I think we'll come back to that because we need to explain insulin in terms of type 1 diabetes.
Sure.
We'll come back to testing in a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's a difference between different types of diabetes. So with type 1, it's autoimmune in origin, and the immune system takes out kind of the defective cells, which tend to be concentrated in that pancreas area for those of us that do have type 1. So when those beta cells, as they're called, those insulin secreting beta cells are taken out, what ends up happening is we don't secrete as much insulin. And as a result, that blood sugar tends to rise, right? So we're not able to have the insulin to take it from the carbohydrates from the bloodstream to the cells. And as a result, you need to supplement with something like insulin. So that's what I take. I take what's called Novolog and Basaglar, which are two forms of insulins that really help to regulate my levels so I ultimately feel the best that I can day in and day out, right? And again, when those levels are thrown off, then you do start to feel very poorly physically, right? So that's more of an insulin deficiency. The type 2 is more so that insulin resistance that we talked about. So that's kind of the origin. And with insulin resistance, that can be due to that excess insulin, of course, but the contributing factors to that can be things like sleep and stress and macro balance and micronutrient imbalances. Things like iron can play a big role in that as well. So there's a lot of different pieces. Again, it's not just one, but either way, that origin is more so that insulin resistance. So, for those with type 2, especially as a result of that insulin resistance, they tend to secrete a lot of glucose from the liver. So their liver is putting out a lot of glucose. And typically the prescription for someone with type 2 is something like metformin, which actually negates that liver glucose output, right? So metformin is typically used in that circumstances. And that's probably not the most ideal. I mean, there's some side effects that we can get into today, but that's one of the reasons why type 2s do see an increase in blood sugar is that insulin resistance, and then their liver is putting out extra glucose into the bloodstream as well.
Well, let's talk about some of the testing now for how you diagnose diabetes. So there's two tests in Australia that I know of and most people would know of. The glucose tolerance test, where you drink, I think is it 75 grams of carbohydrate on its own in a juice, in a liquid form, and then you have to sit there for a couple of hours and they'll take your bloods, and they make you do it when you're pregnant, and I got out of it when I was pregnant. And you might explain why it's not a test I wanted to do. And the HbA1c test. So, and there's probably some others that they do as well, but maybe we'll just start with the glucose tolerance test.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the glucose tolerance test, I think, it can be a good measure of things. I don't necessarily think it actually estimates real life. I don't know, because in real life, you might have some protein, you might have some fat with that meal. So, with the glucose tolerance test, what they're giving you, like you said, Layla, is a form of glucose solution, very concentrated, about that 75 grams. And you take that, and then they measure your blood sugar level about 2 hours afterwards. And if there is a challenge with blood sugar, typically that number is going to be more than 140 for us Americans, and then for those of us that use millimoles, over 7.8. So that can be I don't want to say maybe a nice way, but just a barometer of where that kind of blood sugar or your ability to tolerate carbohydrates really stands there for you. Typically, what they will do is take a fasting blood sugar before this test to confirm whether you do have a blood sugar challenge, and then ultimately confirm it with something like a oral glucose tolerance test like this. And if it's over 200, that would potentially indicate a diabetes diagnosis. And what they like to do is take that test, glucose tolerance, a fasting blood sugar, and in my experience, they like to take an A1C as well. So the hemoglobin A1C is another test that they confirm, and really just shows you the average of where your blood sugar has been over the course of the last 3 months, right? And if it's between 5.7 and 6.4, that would indicate a pre-diabetes, so just before a diabetes diagnosis. And then anything over 6.4 would be that diabetes diagnosis, type 2, right? And type 1 as well. So that's what they would use as that barometer. For those with type 1, there is a slight difference. They would also test antibodies as well. The one that I received was called the GAD65 antibody test, and that tested positive. So for those of us to test for that type 1, there is that autoimmune, the antibody test that also is included with that to make that type 1 diagnosis as well.
It's how do you feel about the test? Do you feel like they're accurate enough? Are they giving us a true picture? Because one of the issues that I had with doing that glucose tolerance test is that I get up at 6 a.m. and then I wouldn't be able to have the test until after 9 a.m. So it's 3 hours of no food while I'm up doing stuff. And then to go and have 75 grams of glucose just on its own, which I would never do. And the doctor, when I was talking to the obstetrician, he said, well, it'd just be like if you went to a party and you had too much cake and a little too much champagne. And I was like, do you want me to do that when I'm pregnant? And he was like, well, not really.
Yeah. In my opinion, I don't really like the glucose tolerance test because, like I said, I don't think it simulates real life. And even if you are drinking, for example, a soda with a lot of concentrated sugar, typically someone is going to be eating something with that too, or might have something close by. So again, I don't know if it simulates real life, but it's a test nonetheless. I ultimately like to look at maybe other measures in addition to that, but for that one, not so sure. With the A1C though too, it's not showing those ups and downs in blood sugar as well. So there's pros and cons with each of these tests. No test is really perfect. But with the A1C, again, it's showing that average of where that blood sugar has been, but it doesn't capture those ups and downs that you might have, those roller coaster blood sugars, right? So even with the A1C, it isn't necessarily the most accurate in terms of capturing those day-to-day measures. For those that, and this is not something that we mentioned yet, but I wear something called a continuous glucose monitor, and that monitors kind of your time and range. And this wouldn't be something I would recommend for everybody, but especially for those that are on some type of insulin or have type 1 diabetes, that can be helpful because it's tracking the amount of time that you're spending in that target range, right? So that can give you a better picture versus the A1C, which is just the average and doesn't show those ups and downs.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had the A1C, but I've always been a person that suffers from low blood sugar. And I have autoimmune Hashimoto's, which we can probably talk about because one of the things I was always told when every endocrinologist I said was that I had such a high level of antibodies that I was likely to develop type 1 diabetes as well.
Yeah. And I do say that quite a bit, with any sort of autoimmune condition, sometimes they do come in pairs. So I have clients that have like celiac disease, for example, and not able to tolerate gluten. As you mentioned, I have a few clients that also have Hashimoto's, so the autoimmune form of hypothyroidism. So sometimes those do actually come in pairs, and that was something that they tested for me there as well, was antibodies to the thyroid because of that association.
Yeah, I have celiac disease too, so it'd be good to come back and talk about why that is, that autoimmune cascade, because of course one of the things everybody thinks when they have autoimmune is they should give up sugar because sugar is bad for your immune system.
Right. Absolutely. Yep. And, carbohydrates are a hot topic these days, and there's all sorts of protocols created to avoid them. But in a sense, if we go back to physiology, there in any good human physiology textbook is going to say glucose is the prime energy source for the body. And any good study will say that as well. And that's important because carbohydrates, to some extent, they are needed to support things like thyroid health. And with thyroid health, it ultimately impacts every single cell in the body. Broda Barnes was so influential, if the listeners are familiar with him as well. And when you think about every single cell in the body, that's a lot of different areas of the body. That's a lot of different functions from your mental and physical health and energy, and even things like blood sugar as well.
So do you think thyroid's more of a precursor to diabetes?
It certainly can be. And Broda Barnes wrote about that too, where he was experiencing some clients that had pre-diabetes, and as a result of giving them thyroid, their blood sugar normalized. So doesn't necessarily me telling people, hey, you just need to take thyroid and all things are well and good. But it's just kind of looking at maybe the lifestyle factors that could be contributing to that thyroid imbalance. So you can ultimately get that going, and that as a domino effect as a result can help to support the blood sugar too.
I've certainly seen that with myself and with a lot of clients, like having blood sugar issues, doing all the right things with food, and then needing some thyroid hormone, and then no longer having blood sugar issues, pre-diabetes, or easing of type 1 diabetes. So then let's have how does insulin, like when you take medicated insulin, is that a set dose for you? Is that like the doctor said to you for life, you need this dose? Is there anything that you can do to influence that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a hot topic and a question I get quite a bit. And when it comes to like the dosing of insulin, that can be something that changes over time, especially as you kind of get older. For those that are typically diagnosed with type 1, it's something that is kind of termed the juvenile diabetes, meaning that it's tended to be diagnosed when you're younger, but that's not always the case either. But as you get older, sometimes if diet or lifestyle isn't quite as supportive, type 1 diabetes can start to look a little bit more similar to something like type 2. So they might tend to experience a little bit more insulin resistance. And as a result, their insulin dosages may need to go up, and or they might be prescribed other medications to ultimately regulate that too. So with those dosages, that's something that can change, especially upon when you're first diagnosed with type 1. You might be very insulin sensitive at that time. But whenever you're taking any sort of hormone, this is kind of important to understand too, that your body will just naturally not produce as much. And that's the same thing with if you look at thyroid too, or any form of supplemental hormone. I was on testosterone therapy for a time too, but it makes your body almost lazy in a sense. So it's almost a catch-22. Well, you need insulin, but it's going to downregulate your ability to produce that a little bit too. So over time, dosages do tend to increase, partly because of that, but also if your lifestyle isn't set up in accordance to what is supportive for you, sometimes that insulin resistance can tend to increase there.
So can you use diet to influence how much you rely on injecting yourself with insulin?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And partly can be due to maybe the meal balance that you have. It can be partly due to the kinds of carbohydrates that you are taking in. Lifestyle, things like sleep. Sleep can, if you're not getting the appropriate amounts of sleep, it can increase insulin resistance. I just saw a study by up to like 80%. So there's these underlying factors that if you do have those in place and they're ultimately supportive, it can make it a little bit easier to manage even things like type 1 diabetes. Now, I will say, while there's things that you can do, I haven't seen enough evidence that you can kind of get off of insulin. There's mice studies that indicate, you can regenerate beta cells through various things, but I just haven't seen enough, especially human studies, to be able to look at that. But that doesn't mean you can't make it easier to living in a way that's ultimately supportive, and that goes back to diet and stress and sleep and movement throughout the day that can be very supportive to the amount of insulin that you have to take.
That's interesting too, because Jay Feldman was talking about with mice studies and rat studies is that we need so much more glucose in comparison to a mouse or a rat because we have such bigger brains. So sometimes those studies are not indicative of enough of how we would actually work with glucose and sugars and things. So what about with metformin? Because like we said before, that is so often and easily prescribed, and I'm finding it very overprescribed in my opinion, metformin. How does it work and what are the side effects?
Yeah, absolutely. So metformin is pretty typically, at least in the US here, the go-to when it comes to managing type 2 diabetes. And the actions that it basically gets at is that liver that's putting out the extra glucose into the bloodstream. And as a result, it regulates the output. It decreases a process called gluconeogenesis. If your listeners are familiar with that, where it's putting out all these carbohydrates. So it reduces that process, and as a result, blood sugar tolerance improves. The problem with metformin is what it does, and you can find this in studies too, it depletes the body of something called copper, which is this mineral that's very influential in metabolism, very influential in ultimately your ability to tolerate carbohydrates at the end of the day. So over time, I see when someone is on metformin, it really plays a big role, a negative role in their metabolism, and tends to be where they kind of need more and more metformin over time in order to sustain that balanced blood sugar level, right? So that's what I typically see, and I believe part of that is probably due to metformin's ability to deplete that copper, which is already deficient in a lot of, especially here in America, where we have so much iron fortification, and copper-rich foods aren't something that are practiced traditionally here, especially in my generation. So that can be one of the main issues when it does come to metformin, and in my opinion, isn't really addressing kind of the root cause, because when we think about excess gluconeogenesis, typically some of the root contributors behind that, just through research that I've seen, can be excess of iron stored away, or something called lipid peroxidation, which basically just means a lot of unsaturated fats, which are causing a level of inflammation in the body there as well. So those two components. And then, of course, metformin is kind of the gas on the fire, so to speak, because it's chelating, it's depleting us of the very mineral that would be helpful in regulating those two processes.
And there's, so many diets that are deficient in copper. Vegan diets, vegetarian diets, even paleo diets, and they can all be deficient in copper, especially grain-based diets, standard American diet. So it's interesting, right? Because I'll often have someone come to me and say, but I'm healthy and I eat clean, but I have been told that I have type 2 diabetes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think it's easy to kind of generalize of eating clean, or there's a different definition that I think each person kind of has with that, or what does clean eating mean? Does it mean you're washing your produce, or so I think each of us relates to that different, but I think this is where the specifics are super important, and having some level of knowledge. It doesn't mean you have to have the same knowledge as maybe someone like you, Layla, or someone like me, but just having a general sense of maybe some of those minerals that are ultimately supportive, and some of those foods that are ultimately supportive for you. And that part of that is maybe advocating for yourself. I think that's such a big thing nowadays, because we view maybe doctors or other health professionals as that authority figure and just take their word at it. But I think with my experience, personal experience and professional, that often does people a disservice, because it doesn't enhance their ability to really advocate for themselves and create their own vision of health and own journey of health, instead of just relying on somebody else to do that for them. So really looking into more of the specifics of, what does clean eating really mean, and then looking at kind of the macronutrient, micronutrient balance, as well as lifestyle factors beyond that. And part of that can be, listening to, of course, podcasts like this to gain that information, or working with a great coach such as yourself, and learning more about that, bouncing ideas, getting feedback on food logs or what that means, because sometimes we're too close to the problem. We can't kind of see out of it. And that's what was so helpful for me working with Josh, and being able to see that, oh, wait, there's a lot of holes here that are probably ultimately making the difference between me not feeling well and ultimately seeing some progress here.
You're so right. I think it's even like myself as a coach, at the moment I'm trying to do weight loss, and so sometimes I can get too stuck in my own head. Like, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do a surplus? Should I do muscle gains? What should I do? So I call Libby Westcombe and we do a game plan, because you need someone outside of yourself who's not close to the problem to go, let's just strategize it and implement some things. And I think because ultimately even a coach can have an idea of what might be a good idea, right? But we never actually know how it's going to respond. The client's going to respond until we take data and test. And, so I might eat a different amount of carbohydrate than you do. And I might eat a different amount of protein that you do. So if I said, oh, Isaac, I've got Hashimoto's and my doctor told me that I'm at very high risk of getting type 1 diabetes. And you say, well, I have that, so here's what I do. You just do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And we all have our own health journey, and ultimately what's going to be supportive for someone like me may not be for you. And I think that often creates some confusion because I don't think the specifics were able to kind of capture that over the social media. And so people might be confused upon, hey, I thought you said this on social media, but you said this other thing during our coaching call. And sometimes that can create like just a level of confusion that, who is right here? Who do I follow? But at the end of the day, that experimentation, as you said, can make such a big difference. And of course, having that guided experimentation, I think it can really accelerate some things for you. So as you mentioned, working with Libby or someone who might have a perspective other than yourself, no matter how intelligent you might be or how much training that you might have, just another set of eyes on that can make a difference for even of us that have more of that advanced training or know some things, because just having some guidance even for us can make a world of difference. And that's one of the reasons why I reached out to Josh and wanted to get his perspective on things. So absolutely, those mentors, another set of eyes can make all the world of difference.
100%. So let's talk about the liver, because I think it's important to understand the liver's role in blood sugar. And we did have a whole episode on the liver with Jay Feldman. So, we touched on that a little bit, but can we talk a little bit about the liver just to understand how it relates to diabetes and blood sugar handling?
Yeah, absolutely. So the liver can be such an important piece when it comes to blood sugar because it's almost this backup system that we talked about. So when stress increases, the glycogen, the stored glycogen that we have in our liver is ultimately released, and that allows us to survive that energy crisis that we talked about before. So the liver is so key in ultimately our survival and blood sugar balance to make sure that we aren't dropping too low, so that it can be make a world of difference. I will say, if you are eating more so a low carb diet or more of a chronic low carb, typically you're not going to have as much stored glycogen away. And the thing about the liver is it's a prime site for the activation of thyroid hormone. And to ultimately activate it, you need that fuel coming in the form of carbohydrates. And that's not to say that you need a ton of them. It doesn't mean you need hard carb diet, but you need some coming in that allows for that activation of thyroid hormone. And that occurs in the liver, right? That's a primary site for that. And we know that when thyroid hormone is activated, it increases metabolism, it increases our ability to use those carbohydrates for fuel. And as a result, that blood sugar generally falls into place as a result of that. So there's these domino pieces from the liver to the thyroid to the blood sugar that are all connected. But if you don't kind of understand that pathway, it can be difficult to think of, wait, how is the liver related to blood sugar balance here? So that is certainly a big player. And you touched on the metformin before, and with the liver, when we have a micronutrient imbalance, so we have too much iron stored away, or we have a history of consuming a lot of vegetable oils and have a lot of inflammation going on there, the liver can actually become insulin resistant and contribute to that excess release of glucose. It's helpful when it's released in balance, right, to regulate those lows that we might come across. But when it's in excess, that's where things like the type 2 diabetes can come into play. And that's why the metformin, people see some benefits with that, because it's reducing that excess release of glucose. So that can be another way that the liver might play an adverse role if we have those micronutrient imbalances, eating foods fortified in iron or high in excess unsaturated fats and just not enough copper, for example.
Such a good explanation. Thank you. So I guess the first thing that we talk about when you get told that you have, especially type 1, is to control your carbohydrate intake. Can we just talk about that one in relation to, well, the standard American diet? So I would say that there's a few different things we should talk about. One is the standard American diet, which I would call the standard Australian and United Kingdom diet as well.
Yeah.
We don't have as much fortification in our foods in Australia, but I'd say that, you know, everyone's pretty much accustomed to eating packaged and processed food as a standard, 60 to 80% of the population, not necessarily all the listeners here today. But then also the food pyramid diet, which is kind of your more cereals-based kind of diet. How do those two diets affect getting type 2?
Absolutely. Yep. And the standard American diet, or SAD as it's known as, I think can play a huge role because, with America here, you mentioned maybe fortification not being a huge part of overseas, Australia, but it certainly is here, huge fortified foods. And, a lot of our food supply is, as you mentioned, coming from those processed food items. So as you can imagine, if a lot of those products are fortified, we're getting a ton of iron. And if you look at just something like, for example, cereal, a lot of these cereals, 1 cup can contain almost like 12, 15 milligrams of iron, and we only need like about 1 milligram per day. So as you can imagine, that can really build up, and we don't have this system, especially when it comes to iron, to really excrete it other than females who have a menstrual cycle. So that's where, things like blood donation can play a role, but that's another rabbit hole. But when it comes to that SAD diet, that can be one of the players, is that not only just the iron, the fortified, the processed food products, but the fact that they are grains. So when it comes to this carbohydrate spectrum, having those details is important because there's a difference between something like a piece of fruit and a piece of bread. There's a much of a difference between what will happen and how that will impact your blood sugar. And what I find is working with clients, even myself, if I were to eat a piece of bread versus a piece of fruit, my blood sugar would spike a lot higher with that piece of bread than the piece of fruit. And the reason for that is because that piece of bread has 100% glucose, which is a carbohydrate that requires insulin to be absorbed. So for those of us who have an insulin deficiency, for those of us that are experiencing some form of insulin resistance, we know that pathway is disrupted, right? So the carbohydrates that rely on that pathway are ultimately going to be a little bit more difficult to tolerate. And that's why you see those that are maybe struggling with carbohydrates to maybe struggle a little bit more with the grains, so the breads, the pasta, the rice, any sort of processed cracker or pastry. Those are going to be a little bit more difficult to tolerate because of that grain proportion, that 100% glucose. And when you compare this to maybe like a piece of fruit or squash or root veggies that might have a little bit of what's called fructose, which is a carbohydrate that doesn't rely on insulin, that can be a little bit more supportive to things like blood sugar balance because it's not affecting the insulin pathway. So things can stay a little bit more in balance with things like fructose. Now, the difference with the SAD diet is a lot of this fructose, if you will, is coming from, high fructose corn syrup, which is totally different. Totally different, isn't even close remotely the same as something like fructose from fruits. So the high fructose corn syrup is actually something that, going back to the metformin, chelates copper. So it wastes copper being a huge player with metabolism, huge player with blood sugar, that can create all sorts of issues in their food supply. I'm not sure what it's like there overseas, but at least in America here, that's a huge component of sodas added to processed food products that it plays a huge role in health conditions these days. So that's another one. And one other that makes like a huge difference too would be the unsaturated fats, or just the vegetable oils that we use here today, especially with fast foods or packaged food products. Just the amount of omega-6s that are in our food supply ultimately lead to that lipid peroxidation when in excess, and can go into influencing a state of diabetes as well when continued chronically. So that can be quite another one to consider, and very significant.
So that, I guess the other thing to consider with the standard American diet, it's very low in protein, right? So to say that the American diet is just high in sugar and fat is kind of just this blanket statement that isn't really looking at the context of everything, because then people just go, well, sugar is bad and fat is bad. Mm-hmm. But it's also very low in protein, and it's the types of sugar and fat that are being consumed, right? But can you talk about the protein part?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on a great point here, that we label all carbs the same, or all proteins the same, or all fats the same. And they certainly have different effects. And that's where understanding kind of the basics or more of the details there can be helpful, because it gives us more context to them, instead of just slapping a label that, hey, this is bad, we should avoid it, right? So there is certainly a difference between those two. And as you hit on, and something that I didn't point out too, was the protein. And that's what I see all the time in food logs, is that people are constantly deficient in protein and are just not eating enough, and those carbohydrates or those fats might be higher, but we don't have enough protein to ultimately sustain ourselves. And protein can be such a big player when it comes to blood sugar balance too, and ultimately satisfying you long after the meal as well. And when we look at our food environment today, that's not a lot of the foods emphasized. And it's almost in a way a challenge for people to find some protein, or making sure that they're hitting their protein to the point where they are ultimately supporting themselves, because protein plays a huge role in blood sugar balance. It plays a huge role in digestion, and ultimately stimulating something like hydrochloric acid, where we can properly digest our food. So it's this crucial component that a lot of us are probably missing. And with, at least here in America too, a lot of it is emphasized our muscle meats, right? And going back to the details of protein, we're probably not getting enough of a variety of proteins, seafood, liver, dairy, etc. So, with the meat being fully present there, it's looking at getting a variety, because with foods, there's mineral components associated with that too. Liver, you have vitamin A and copper, whereas something like beef, you wouldn't have that same extent of those that mineral balance. So we're missing out on a lot of those micronutrients, in addition to what our food supply is in relationship with kind of those protein sources as well. So knowing kind of those nuances to that, as well as just making sure that you're getting enough, can be helpful aspects to consider.
And then you have that aspect of animals being grain-fed versus grass-fed, right? How does that affect our liver and blood sugar?
Absolutely. And again, it's going back to the details of it, right? The quality of your food. And I always recommend to any client getting the best quality that you can get, because ultimately what is fed to the animals ultimately ends up in that protein product as a result. So with grain fed, that's going to be a little bit higher in iron, that we mentioned is kind of this crucial point when it comes to insulin resistance and blood sugar stability, versus a grass-fed, it's going to be a little bit more supportive. It's not going to contain as much iron, particularly the liver products as well. If you look at something like grain-fed liver versus grass-fed, there's going to be a better balance when it comes to copper and iron versus something that is grain-fed. So the foods that these animals are having is so important, and why sourcing the quality of your products really ends up mattering, because those minerals end up in our food and we eat that food. So that becomes a part of ourselves as well. So getting that quality products, and when it is grass-fed, they're going to be a little bit more quality fats there too, because the cows are eating that nutrient-rich grass, not the grain-fed products, which make things a little bit more of a fattier cut in my experience. So that can be another good area to consider. Where are you sourcing your foods from? Can you get the best quality that you can get? Ultimately, I do recommend getting non-GMO organic as you can, but understand each person kind of has a different budget and different lifestyle, what that looks like. But either way, looking at kind of the quality of what that food looks like can make a big difference in the progress that you do see.
So the fats is really important. Let's talk about the fats. So obviously, like with eating a grass-fed animal, you're going to get vitamin E with that fat. That's going to help with the PUFA content. Let's talk about PUFAs, because this is a big problem in the liver and blood sugar handling. And I think what can be also missed in a whole foods diet, because some whole foods diets can actually be high in polyunsaturated fats, especially vegetarian diets. Can we talk? So people always think of bad fats, and we have talked about this a bit on the show, and there's a whole episode with Matt Blackburn on these healthy fats. I'm saying that in air quotes. But I'd really like you to get more specific in terms of diabetes. So everyone assumes that the trans fats are bad, so like your cooking oils, and people generally know that. But then, and that's what is bad about the standard American diet. It's, full of those kinds of fats, and we become too high in those fats. So please explain that, but then also explain the PUFAs that are in health foods and how that affects our state with blood sugar and the liver.
Yeah. So there's certainly a difference between how fats ultimately impact us, and as you hit on it, those unsaturated fats can be when in excess. And I'm not here to create any fear mongering by any means, but they're a little bit less supportive ultimately, especially if you're cooking things in vegetable oil, right? So they're a little bit more higher in omega-6, and those unsaturated fats are ultimately not the most supportive, or where you want to be getting the bulk of your fat sources, because one, they're not rich in some of those fat soluble vitamins that you mentioned. So the vitamin A, the vitamin E, especially, which are so crucial when it comes to any sort of health related goal there. So that's number one. They're not really nutrient dense sources of fats. And number two, especially when they are cooked, or even before they even enter our body, they're very reactive fats. So they react to elements such as heat, light, oxygen. And even if you can imagine eating those, and when it goes into your body, we're at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or whatever that is in Celsius. So we're a very warm body species. And as a result, those unsaturated fats can really contribute to a lot of inflammation if they are in excess, because of that instability and the elements that we encounter either before we eat them or when we do consume them, because our body is very warm. It's very oxygen rich, right? So that can be a crucial thing to understand, that they're just a little bit more unstable. Versus if you compare that to a saturated fat, they're not as unstable. They're more of a stable fat. They don't react in the presence of heat and light and oxygen to the same degree, and in fact melt. And when you think about like a solid fat, I think this is one of the confusion points too. When you look at like a jar of coconut oil too, right? When it's cold out, it's like a solid, and people think that, oh, that's going to clog my arteries because that's a solid fat, not understanding that fat has a certain melting point, and it's not going to contribute to that clogging of arteries. What really contributes to that is a level of inflammation and in the body, which is a whole other rabbit hole. But it's important to understand that saturated fat doesn't stay solid when it enters your body. It doesn't clog your arteries in that way, shape, or form. So I think that can be kind of a simple association, but just simply isn't true. So with those saturated fats, they can be more supportive because they're ultimately more stable and they don't contribute to that same inflammation. But at the same time, keeping them within balance, because we know when we're consuming too much fat, our ability to ultimately tolerate carbohydrates goes down. So while we need them, while they're a great source of fat-soluble vitamins, particularly the saturated fats, keeping them within balance with the protein and the carbs that you're consuming throughout the day can make a great level of difference when it comes to the insulin resistance and just achieving the best blood sugar balance that you can.
This is a big thing, I think, because now you're sort of explaining why the ketogenic diet, it's another layer, like it's low carb, but it's also high in fat. Like it's not actually high in protein, it's high in fat. Same with the paleo diet. It's very hard to eat paleo without overeating fat. But also a lot of people coming to the pro-metabolic space and like, I took the list of foods from the pro-metabolic list and I'm eating all the foods, and they've never logged before, and they're putting on a lot of weight and they're still having a lot of blood sugar handling problems and thyroid problems. And then they actually do a log and they're eating like 50% more fat. And they're like, but it's good fat. I was told it was good fat and I'm not eating any PUFAs. And, you know, that's really going to disrupt blood sugar handling as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And that's kind of going back to maybe your comment on the clean eating, right? You're doing everything right. And it certainly might look like that. Absolutely. And I think there's just a different perspective when you start to create that awareness, as you said, and just the act of logging that and getting in tune with that, because we might believe one thing at the start, or might have one thing in our mind, but when we actually really tune in, pay a little bit closer attention, monitor that more closely, we start to understand that, oh, wait, I'm consuming a lot of fat here, or, oh, wait, maybe I'm not eating enough protein here. So that can create such a level of awareness. The problem being that I don't know a lot of people that like logging. It takes time. It takes parts of your day out to do that and to dedicate to that. And for some people, it's hard to stay consistent with it. But there's such a benefit on the back end of that, because if you use it correctly, it can really tell you where you need to go when it comes to those challenges that you are having.
So when you have someone who is having blood sugar handling issues and diabetes symptoms, and how much fat do you recommend?
Yeah, great question. I think it always goes back to meeting the person where they are. So when it comes to someone who's coming from me for like they're coming from like a ketogenic background, and let's say they're super stressed and just aren't sleeping well. Well, for that person, I'm going to go really slow with them. I'm not going to introduce quite as near carbs or quite as quickly as someone who's had more of that practice and been eating them for a period of time. If it's something, like the standard American diet, for example, they might be eating a little bit less fat than someone on keto. So they might be able to tolerate a little bit more carbs, or maybe go a little bit more aggressively with that. So it just kind of depends on the person, right? It's meeting them where they are. So I'm not sure if there's a certain percentage. And the way I start off with clients too is more so on like a food and mood style log. So they really start to become aware of, what does that balance sort of look like for them? And not necessarily in the macro sense, but just in the sense of, hey, am I having a protein with this meal? Am I having a carb or a veggie with this meal? Am I having some sort of fat? And just that alone can really indicate a level of balance. Where I see that high fat coming into play would be, where we consider healthy fats, right? Maybe they have something like a piece of toast in the morning and they put butter on that toast, and then they cook their eggs in butter and have multiple eggs. And then, maybe have some sort of fried potato in butter, so that all that fat tends to add up, even though if it's, supportive fats, right? That would be a scenario, would be like, hey, maybe we can look at maybe some leaner options here, maybe a different way of cooking this, maybe pairing the eggs with a leaner source of protein. So that's where I see those adjustments taking place. And of course, with maybe the more experienced person, maybe we would jump into macros, of course, and maybe look at, 25% calories fat. But that would be where I would start with first, not necessarily the macros, but just what does that meal balance look like for them in relationship to the carbs and protein, and meeting that person where they're at.
And I guess it's people not understanding that 1 gram of carbohydrate and 1 gram of protein is 4 calories, whereas 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. So when you're talking about percentages and your meal, you can't really eyeball it, because people kind of want to put everything on their plate and eyeball it. And, because they've been taught that. And so it's like, oh, the fat's the smallest part, but it's actually 9 times bigger than you think it is.
Yeah, exactly. It's double the calories essentially. And, I think that could play a role in initial weight gain that you might have on this pro-metabolic style, whatever you want to call it, style of eating, in addition to maybe going too fast with the carbohydrates there, because we know fat, as you said, it's double the calories as something like carbs and protein. And some people might not be aware of that fact.
And we're sort of like, we're not saying, Isaac and I start saying you have to focus on calories and it's all about calories, but if you can't eat 3,000 calories if you want. So some people are logging and for me, and they'll come and like eating like 3,000 calories. I'm like, well, that's why you put on weight. We can't eat in excess of calories. But there are also people who are under eating too. Definitely. I would say most of my clients actually under eat as a whole. So, and have blood sugar handling issues. Do you want to touch on that a little bit? Because I think most people assume that when you go and see someone, or they say you're overweight, you need to just eat less.
Right. Yep. Eat less and move more. Right.
Yeah.
That's the common advice. Yep. And I don't think that's doing people a disservice, or it's not doing people a service ultimately, because there are several factors, several contributors to blood sugar handling issues. And the more that we the more that we don't eat or exercise more, that's ultimately not getting towards the problem, because the problem is the inability to tolerate carbohydrates and to ultimately improve that. And to some extent, if you have type 1 diabetes, you can improve that. But obviously, we know there's an insulin issue there. But, for others, there's things that we can do to ultimately improve upon that and increase our ability to improve that carbohydrate tolerance so that you can eat more, right? And when it comes to eating less, we know if you're not eating enough to ultimately support that metabolism, our ability to tolerate carbohydrates goes down, right? So there's a piece of that we just think that what we eat influences our blood sugar. Well, we also know that when we're not eating in a way that supports our metabolism, that's a stress to the body. And what do we know about stress? We know stress increases insulin resistance, increases blood sugar. So that can be a way that if we're not eating in a way that's ultimately supportive, you might see a rise in that blood sugar. Just as Broda Barnes saw with his patients with pre-diabetes when their thyroid wasn't up to par, right? Their blood sugar was a bit higher. So that can be one way that if you're not eating enough or not eating enough of the right supportive foods ultimately in the balance that works for you, that can be a way that if you are eating less than what you should, that blood sugar can still be high for those reasons.
So it's really important to get that log right, rather than just assume that someone has overweight, so they must be eating too much. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about some of the big things that sugars. So white sugar, is white sugar bad for us?
Yeah, and I always like to stray away from not necessarily labeling all foods like bad or good. I think there's supportive foods and maybe some that aren't as supportive, but I always like to kind of stray away from mongering or labeling things, with maybe the exception of vegetable oils. I'm not sure if that there's much benefit to that, but yeah. Ultimately, in moderation, I think white sugar can be a part of a balanced routine. For someone like me with type 1 diabetes, that's one of the things that spikes blood sugar quickest. So obviously for someone like me, I need to be a little bit more cognizant of those carbohydrate choices, especially more of those refined. But that doesn't mean I can't have them. I just have to have the right strategies in place to be able to support, and things like insulin dosaging and techniques and like that can really be supportive to that. But in moderation, sure, absolutely. And I think there's a part of life of just enjoying it and making sure that whatever journey, whatever style of eating that you're on, that is ultimately sustainable for you. And if white sugar makes that more enjoyable for you, all the power to you. I think there are ultimately more supportive carb choices for the majority of your calories, but every now and then having, sugar with your coffee or whatever, wherever that comes in at, if that helps it to stay sustainable for you, I'd say all the power to you. It always goes back to, hey, are you making progress? Are you enjoying it? And is this a sustainable way of eating that works for you?
And I would say, I guess, as well, as when you're looking at someone's logs, like I use Chronometer, it's like, are you meeting all your minerals and micronutrients and everything else with your other carb sources? And so then you had a teaspoon of sugar here or there, that's okay. It's going to count to your overall carb content, but obviously sugar is an empty calorie, like if there's no minerals but if you're meeting all your minerals, then it's like, okay, you can have a teaspoon of sugar here and there. It's not a big deal. I guess maybe you can elaborate more on, I think what's happened as well is people go, well, white sugar is bad, so instead I'm going to use all this honey and maple syrup and all these other sugar kind of things, and some of them do have more minerals than white sugar, yes, for sure, so you could consider them healthier. But there's a problem with just switching from one sugar to the other sugar without understanding the contents of macronutrients, right? The context.
Absolutely. Yep. You hit on a great point there, Layla, the context of what does that look like for the person? Are they including, mineral dense, nutrient dense sources of foods throughout their day? Are they including fruits or root veggies or squash? Are they including nutrient dense proteins like liver, beef, or, dairy, etc., seafood? Are they including supportive fats? So what does the context of the diet look like there for them? And obviously not making it up the majority of the diet would ultimately be most optimal, because the body runs on minerals. That's like the foundation of health, in my opinion. And if we don't have that foundation in place, if we start incorporating all these nutrient not dense, less nutrient dense sources of foods, particularly carbohydrates, that often just exacerbates some of the symptoms in my experience just working with people. So ensuring you have some level of foundation before, incorporating a lot of those different food items that maybe are a little bit more emptier in terms of nutrients, I think can be helpful. And of course, context is super helpful there too.
Yeah, because you don't want people to be paralyzed by eating, because sometimes making a chocolate milk before bed, or having some homemade ice cream before bed, and having some white sugar in that when you've met all your other requirements for the day is actually fine. No one get people to. I hate it when, like you say, food is fear-mongered. So it's like, I have a 4-year-old and all the parents around me are so afraid of giving their kids any sugar. And it's like, well, they can have a little bit of sugar if they have enough protein and they have enough carbohydrate, whole carbohydrates like fruits and roots, and having a little bit of sugar for ice cream is not such a bad thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's almost like that pink elephant, or that thing that you restrict often comes back to haunt you in a way, because in my experience, the more that you restrict something, the more that you want it. So I think there's like a kind of a mindset game with that too, is that, if you place a lot of restrictions on yourself, what's the domino effect of that afterwards? Do you end up consuming even more than you would have liked to in the first place? And I find that to be the case too, when we do place those labels on food of, oh, this is bad, I shouldn't be eating this, or restrict it fully. What's the domino effect? You end up, just binging out on that, right? Later on. So that's something that I've seen as well.
So fructose is always deemed as bad as well. Let's talk a little bit about fructose. Sure. So we're going to go through all the myths around sugar here, everybody. So white sugar in serious moderation after you've met all your other nutritional requirements. But then people have this belief that fruit is bad because it has fructose in it, or even potatoes are on, because they have fructose malabsorption, or all these kinds of things. Let's talk about fructose.
Yeah. Fructose is such a big area, and this was one of the more common questions that I get on social media as well. And when it comes to fructose, and I think that one of the themes of our call here too is just understanding the differences between different carbohydrates or different proteins or different fats, those nuances, and instead of slapping a label on them like all carbs are bad, right? So I think that's the same thing with fructose. There's a difference between high fructose corn syrup and fructose from naturally occurring sources, whether that be, fruits or squash or sweet potatoes or honey, for example. There's a difference between what that fructose does and also responds in the body. And for something like high fructose corn syrup, it's been shown for that fructose is ultimately something that chelates copper. So it's something that takes away a very crucial mineral when it comes to balancing blood sugar and assisting with metabolism. So that right there, alone other things, is one of the major factors when it comes to that difference. Also, just through some research I was recently reading, they were talking about how a lot of the high fructose corn syrup labels were actually incorrect, meaning that a lot of those labels should have been actually higher in carbs than what they showed. So that high fructose corn syrup might actually contain more calories than what's displayed on the label. So that's something that I've also seen in research as well. So that could be another contributing factor that can go into that imbalance. But when you think about something like high fructose corn syrup versus fructose in fruits, there's a difference between that package too, right? When you look at fruit, it has fiber, it has potassium, B vitamins, all these minerals and vitamins in there, versus fructose from soda, the high fructose corn syrup. It's contained in that liquid form typically, or a packaged processed form that spikes your blood sugar up very, very quickly. So there's a difference with the packaging and those supportive attributes as a part of that food as well.
And I think what's important always with food is like people go, oh, well, I'm low in zinc or I'm low in iron. So what food has that in it, right? Rather than understanding that you can't just take what you're lacking of, because food actually works in combinations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit more about it's about combining macronutrients for blood sugar balance, not
absolutely,
and for minerals as well.
Yeah, each of those plays a function, and I spoke a lot about copper today. But what's needed when we copper is obviously needed, but we need vitamin A as well to ultimately support this process where we can actually push copper into a protein called ceruloplasmin, and so we can actually use it. So vitamin A is a huge support with that. And when you look at something like liver, that's what liver has. So if we try to necessarily support ourselves with just like a copper supplement, for example, we're not necessarily getting that other nutrient that's a part of that. And that's why supplementation with individual nutrients like a vitamin C or a zinc or a copper or any other mineral or vitamin that you want to think of, there's all these supportive nutrients on the back end that we might not quite understand that are ultimately important in being able to use that properly. So it's not just about copper, it's also about that vitamin A, right? So that's a big player when it comes to minerals. And the same thing could be said for macronutrients, because we know the carbohydrates are obviously a big key when it comes to the impact that they have on blood sugar. But if you would pair your carbs with a protein, that lessens that effect. You don't get this huge spike, right? So it's not to say that, hey, carbs are bad. What's the context here? Are we consuming them alone? Are we drinking them in a liquid form? Or do we have them paired with some form of protein and fat that helps to stabilize that afterwards? So again, it's what's the context here, and the more that we can kind of get that from a whole food source, because nature really did it right. It's not extracting these isolated nutrients and saying, hey, here's a supplement or here's this individual nutrient. It's saying, hey, all these foods have a variety of different factors with them. They work together. Let's pair these together so ultimately you get the most benefit from it.
Can we also talk about food timing? Because I think this is really important. Like, it's not just it's not what you eat, but it's also when you eat. And I think this is a huge thing in blood sugar handling, because often I'll see sometimes people just have it from accidentally fasting all the time or purposely fasting, especially some people who are overweight and have been told to fast. Can we talk about how important timing is and blood sugar and why that kind of kicks fasting out of the park, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And timing is so important, especially when it comes to those fasting numbers, which are typically checked for those of us with diabetes, is one of the more common ones blood sugar checks there or checked for my clients too. So that's a big one. And when it comes to meal timing, typically what I see with clients is that they might be skipping meals early on in the day or just not feeling hungry. So they might not have a breakfast. They might have a small little lunch or maybe a snack here. And then by the time they get to dinner or that evening, they're extremely hungry and starving and have this huge meal. And ultimately what ends up happening is, especially if you have more so that blood sugar challenge, their fastings will be higher during the day. But that's not just to say that the end of the day is kind of this dysregulated process. We know when we're not eating breakfast or we're not eating those earlier meals, what ends up happening is it increases that insulin resistance that we talked about. So in that effect, I was just looking at the study too, that effect makes its way across the whole entire day. So when you don't have a breakfast meal, later on in the evening, later on in the day, your blood sugar or your insulin resistance is going to be a little bit higher as a result. So it's a day-wide effect. So that blood sugar, the notion that it's the most important meal of the day is certainly true in that facet, that helps to kind of regulate blood sugar not only in the morning, but also during the evening. And when we're not eating in the morning, again, that's increasing in the insulin resistance. For those of us that maybe don't have diabetes, it can make our blood sugar drop a little bit lower there too. So talking about that blood sugar balance, making us feel more irritable, more hangry, and the way that we eat ultimately influences the way that we feel and how we express ourselves too and how we show up. So what ends up happening when we're not eating early enough in the day, you have these dysregulated blood sugar all throughout the day, and that carries over to the next day as well. So looking at ways that you can kind of support yourself earlier on, as I see most commonly, can ultimately be a little bit more supportive, especially for those fasting numbers, because you're meeting your needs early on in the day and your body doesn't have to play catch up and have this huge meal at the end of the day to ultimately feel satisfied.
Do you think also it has to do with density of food, blood sugar handling? Because I find this an interesting one. Like, I'm Asian and I could eat anything for breakfast. The thought of eating cereal for breakfast does not appeal to me at all. I'm actually not someone that does that well on grain. If I had cereal for breakfast, I would be hungry half an hour later. Can we talk a little bit about food density and how that plays into diabetes and blood sugar?
Absolutely. And this is a huge emphasis of mine too. I've made quite a few posts on this on my social media channels as well, because there's a nuance to this, right? There's a difference between different types of carbs and proteins that ultimately can be on the lighter side of things or on the denser side of things. And that can go into how long a certain meal might satisfy you. So for example, a lighter choice might be something that you touched on, the cereal, and maybe you put some level of milk in there, but that's, it has all the macronutrients, right? It has the protein with the milk, it has some fat there, it has some carbs, but it's ultimately going to be very light. It's not going to satisfy you. You're going to be hungry maybe an hour or two after that, right? Versus if you look at something that also includes all the macronutrients. So maybe it's something like butternut squash and a few eggs, right? So you have eggs with the protein and fat, you have butternut squash with the carbs, but it's denser. It has that fiber. It's something that carries you over, satisfies you for maybe 3 hours, 4 hours, right? So that's a dense meal. It's something that will hold you over. It's slower acting, meaning that when you eat that particular meal, that blood sugar is going to slowly rise and slowly fall, versus the lighter options like the cereal that are quick, easy to digest, maybe more processed. It's going to spike blood sugar up and it's going to drop back down or stay elevated. So there's a difference between the different types of macronutrients, and the density can play a huge role, not only in appetite, but also where your blood sugar ends up at the end of the day. So this is like a huge principle that I talk about with clients, because a lot of times they are eating those lighter meals, especially early on in the day, and ultimately can help to, or can hinder them at night, because it leads to them just feeling starving and eating a bunch of food at the end of the day, right? And when it comes to kind of the weight gain, or keeping the balance or calories in check, that can be another one that can ultimately be supportive to that, is eating more of those dense choices, especially if weight loss is ultimately a goal.
And I think it's going to change too with your workouts, right? Like I notice I've been playing around with different food combinations now that I'm putting quite a significant amount of my energy into strength training, and what I need to eat in the morning. I actually need to eat twice before I strength train, sometimes 3 times. And I think that's really interesting because so many people will go to training on an empty stomach. I am lucky. I work for myself, so I can choose to work out in mid-morning, early afternoon. So that's a factor as well. But I notice that I have to eat like at least 2 or 3 times before I train, and I also have to eat quite a lot of muscle meat. And then later in the day, I can pull back on the muscle meat and eat meat, more kind of carb, kind of focused meals. It's really interesting to me. So I have been experimenting lately with porridge after my workout, and I do put egg whites in my porridge and casein powder. So it's still a high density, and not high density, high protein porridge, low density. But after a workout, you really want to quickly uptake the carbohydrate, right, to replenish muscle glycogen. So that's when that meal works for me. And also knowing that I'm going to eat dinner 2 hours later or lunch 2 hours later. So it's so important to log and see how you respond to different foods and the different timings of food. And it's not to say that you can never eat them, because I never would have thought that I'd be able to eat a cereal again, but the oats after training, it's actually working really well for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a big component here, because it's not to say that light foods are bad. It's to say there's a certain context to them, and how you use them ultimately matters the most. And as you mentioned, having that quick absorbing, or quick, meal after or post workout can ultimately be supportive to refilling that glycogen, or, especially if you have maybe a muscle building goal, for example, of getting those nutrients in there quickly. So there's certainly a time and place for everything, I believe.
Yeah, I don't think I could eat it if I wasn't training.
Mm-hmm.
I tried it on a non-training day, and it's just not the same. It's just like straight after a workout, it's like the perfect time for me to have a high carb kind of meal. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So restoring metabolic function, I guess that's the key thing here, right? With diabetes, it's what we talk about so much on the show. So I hope you guys are okay with that. But that comes down to balancing macronutrients, looking at your meal timing, to balance blood sugar. How can you talk a little bit about using temperature and pulse, and how you would use that to look at blood sugar, or tie in with your glucose monitoring that you're doing for the type 1s?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a measurement that I use for some clients, not all, but especially for those that are, having issues with thyroid health, or have been really shown to struggle with blood sugar balance, because depending on the client, it's a lot to log, like their blood sugars and their temperature and pulses. So it's a lot of data that they're kind of throwing around. So I take it, for each person a little bit differently. But if there was going to be a client that I used it for, that can be a good way to monitor things, especially I have them, if they are monitoring blood sugar, maybe take a fasting, but for the rest of the day doing body temperature and pulse. And that can be a great measure of where your metabolism ultimately stands there for you, and how those individual meals are ultimately either supporting or maybe not supporting you. And ultimately, you're wanting both of those to an extent rise after meals. And that goes to show that, hey, that meal was probably supportive for you, provided the balance, the energy that you needed for that specific meal, right? So that's what I would kind of look at. I like to look at that maybe right when they wake up. So immediately upon waking up, like 20 to 30 minutes after breakfast, and then after lunch there as well, just to see how that morning time is going there for them. And when it comes to metabolism and those measures, it can be a great function, because when those are in place, typically that means that blood sugar is also in place, because we know from a domino perspective that when we regulate the metabolism, regulate the thyroid, that down the line plays a role in our ability to manage blood sugar as well. So the two are connected, and that's the reason why monitoring those temps and pulse can ultimately be supportive, not only to that, but just to make sure those meals are ultimately working for you and you're feeling good as a result.
I don't use blood glucose to measure my clients. I'm interested, it's not in my bucket of experience. Do you find that measures well with temper pulse? Is there do they differ? Do you use them together? Obviously I use temper pulse, but I'm interested in how the blood sugar thing works.
Yeah, for the right person, I do use them together, especially if they have a history. Because I have one client that I'm thinking of kind of has pre-diabetes and also has Hashimoto's as well. So for her, she likes to monitor her fasting numbers and kind of see where those lie for her. And ultimately, when I do see them a bit higher is when those temperature and pulses typically aren't within range. So kind of going back to what Broda Barnes was saying, that when he had those pre-diabetes patients whose blood sugar was elevated, and when they put them on thyroid, that those numbers reduced and got in range. I'm seeing similar trends where their blood sugar might be higher in the morning and their temps and pulses might be out of range or not moving up after meals. So ultimately those meals not necessarily supporting them. So that is one way that I've used it before. Yeah.
It's interesting that way too, because when you think about it, I work with a lot of people with thyroid dysfunction, and a lot of them can, and like myself, can have a normal looking thyroid panel, but then have these extreme blood sugar handling issues. And I've had extreme blood sugar handling issues my entire life. So they're told that they don't need a thyroid supplement, but they do need to go on metformin or something, but actually if they take a thyroid supplement, then they don't need the blood sugar treatment, provided that they have met their metabolic needs with their food and timed their food and all of that stuff as well. So It's interesting that you're seeing that as well with clients.
Absolutely. Yep. And for I would say a good majority, we're able to do that through lifestyle, but there are some occasional individuals that, as you said, might benefit from looking at their doctor and seeing if they can get a thyroid prescription for that as well. So to kind of support them. But yes, for the most part, I see you being able to regulate that through lifestyle and through that food frequency, and ultimately making sure that those meals are dense enough or, ultimately to sustain you in a way.
100%.
Yeah.
Are you using any other interventions with clients for helping with that liver function and blood sugar balance, like aspirin and anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I experimented with myself, but that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, I would say, like things like the aspirin. I'm not sure of its viability. I mean, I'd love to hear a perspective of other coaches in that area, but I haven't personally used it with clients there before. And in my view, and this is just my opinion, it's almost like an after effect. Like if we were to just kind of address the root of the problem, the unsaturated fats or the iron piece of it, and looking at how we can best regulate those, that would take care of the things that aspirin is ultimately beneficial for. So that's how I kind of view it. I don't have like a ton of experience with aspirin. I did experiment with it, years ago, but just don't have a lot to go off of, and that's something that I've necessarily done with clients. Yeah,
that's something. I think it's more probably something to speak to Tomo about. Who has his master's and PhD in endocrinology and is familiar more with medications and things like that. So like Georgie, who's going to be on the show next week. So there are applications, but I guess what I'm saying is as well is that often I'll see people and they're taking like all of these things to clean their liver because they've read on the Repeat forum or some other kind of forum or anything, or it's like, oh, niacinamide's really good for cleaning out your liver, or taurine or whatever. And I have diabetes and I should take that. And people message me on Instagram all the time. I have this problem and I saw Matt Blackburn taking all this stuff. Should I take all this stuff? And for a lot of people, you can get better just doing food properly. Mm-hmm. And I think really healing from this stuff is actually moving away from having to take something all the time to fix something.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a firm believer in food first, if we can solve it through that. And I think supplements are such a rabbit hole these days with all the different things out there. And I used to be one of those people that would take, 20, 30 or whatever different supplements at one particular time. And I think that's the case with a lot of clients that I'm getting. They're on so many different things. And I'd imagine that would lead to a level of, confusion or frustration, or just maybe lack of awareness of, hey, what does that do for me? Is that helping? Is that hurting? There's a lot of different variables when you have so many supplements on board, as far as, hey, is this actually helping me at the end of the day? And that's what I kind of take the stance of, hey, less is more here. And if we can do it through food, ultimately that's going to be, in my experience, the most supportive, and where I see clients really progressing the most. Because again, supplements are kind of this isolated form of a nutrient, and through nature we have these supportive cofactors like the vitamin A, for example, that are helpful in us being able to actually use that copper that we speak about. So those are those cofactors, I think, in my opinion, are things that we kind of miss out on sometimes if we're not aware of that.
100%. The only thing we didn't talk about, which we need to talk about, is cholesterol and diabetes, because I see, and personally for myself, so for those who know or follow me or whatever, I did a mold detox, and one of the binders in the mold is actually cholesterol lowering. And so it really messed around with my ability to metabolize fat, and it really messed around with my insulin receptivity and also my leptin. So that's the reason why I put on a huge amount of weight when I was eating nothing. So can we talk about cholesterol and the relationship to, and probably, I guess, about statins, because it is pretty, I can't remember what the percentage is, but it is highly likely if you take some kind of cholesterol-lowering medication that you will end up taking something like metformin. So let's just talk a little bit about the cholesterol and the blood sugar and diabetes issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Cholesterol is definitely a big thing, and it often goes, like you said, hand in hand with blood sugar imbalances as well. So with cholesterol, we know it's a good thing. It's something that ultimately is the backbone for a lot of our steroidal hormones. So it's not bad as people make it out to be. The thing that is ultimately, quote unquote, bad is if you have these high cholesterol levels and then you enter in inflammation. So you're taking in a bunch of iron, or have a lot of iron stored away, or you're consuming or have consumed a lot of unsaturated fats, and that inflammatory process changes cholesterol, and that byproduct called oxysterols can be lodged in the walls of the arteries there. So that's when it can be something that is a little bit more concerning, but it's not the cholesterol that is really doing that. It's more so the inflammation in the arteries that are those contributing factors ultimately. But cholesterol is this important piece because it is the backbone of hormones. And if we don't have that, if we're just simply taking a statin, we're essentially blocking that. And that's where, in my experience, clients might have some hormonal imbalance issues, because that cholesterol is such an important piece to ultimately feeling your best, right? So when it is elevated, ultimately people are going to have some hormonal imbalance issues, because that is that primary substrate that we take to also push that into those hormones, right? So it's all about that conversion, and things that help with those conversion is ultimately a way of eating that supports your metabolism. And Broda Barnes proved this as well. As thyroid function increases, so does your ability to utilize that cholesterol, right? So that's an important piece. And then you have minerals like vitamin C and magnesium and copper that are crucial in being able to assist with that process, kind of like those cofactors that we discussed there before, right? And if you were to simply address this by taking a statin, as you mentioned, there's association with decreased glucose or carbohydrate tolerance upon taking a statin. So there's a lot of individuals that become of increased risk when they do take some form of a statin after the fact for something like type 2 diabetes because of that nature of the statin. So that would be kind of important to understand that there are some risks on the back end. And if you can do something beforehand, whether that's working on metabolism or those mineral balance pieces, as well as things like stress, because we know stress raises cholesterol too. If you can kind of work on those pieces, that might play a big role when it comes to ultimately supporting that cholesterol so you can get it back to a range that works and is able to be converted and diverted to more of those steroidal hormones.
So what about autoimmune disease? Because this is a big one, because type 1 is an autoimmune disease. Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease, which, as far as medical people will say, will often lead to type 1 diabetes. We're told so often to cut out sugar for autoimmune because it elevates the immune response. Can you talk a little bit about antibodies? And it's interesting, right, because I have had my antibodies for Hashimoto's in the 300s. And then restoring metabolic function, having them back down to 0. And I eat sugar and carbohydrates. So can we just talk about this autoimmune aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny how that works. How we envision one thing happening, but when you actually do it in a way that's supportive, as you mentioned, seeing those antibodies reduce. So that's great that you're able to see that success with that. And ultimately, with the immune system eating in a way that's ultimately supportive is something that regulates the levels ultimately. Because I think the one trap that I think some people kind of fall into is, hey, I'm going to eat this way for PCOS. I'm going to eat this way for type 1 diabetes. I'm going to eat this way for type 2. And, there are certain nuances, sure, but, when you support the body, you support the body, right? And, it's kind of as simple as that. And as you mentioned, you found that thing that works for you. And when it comes to immune health, there's certain nuances to it, but when you ultimately eat in a way that's supporting yourself, you're feeling well, your biofeedback, things like energy, digestion, mood, sleep, stress are all in range, are all feeling better. Ultimately, that's going to go a long way into supporting immune health too. So there's not necessarily anything that I would maybe pinpoint as that, hey, this is the one thing that's going to support your immune health. It's just ultimately eating in a way, living, breathing in a way that are ultimately going to support you at the end of the day. And part of that is creating that awareness around, as you mentioned, logging of, hey, what is that lifestyle? What does that food look like for me right now? In my opinion, when it comes to immune health, it all starts with the blood sugar balance. It all starts with that food frequency and developing that and balancing that blood sugar. Because we know when that is in play, it makes it so much easier to sleep well. It makes it so much easier to have the energy to move in the way that you'd like to ultimately. And it makes it so much easier to handle stress, right? So that's where I kind of view it from a sense of maybe not anything specific as in, hey, what supports this particular thing specifically, but more so eating in a way that's supportive, living in a way that's supportive, that ultimately help to balance that immune system, right? So that's what I would kind of look at. And of course, things like, especially when you look at type 1 diabetes being an autoimmune condition, the immune system is not going like all hectic and creating all this chaos for nothing. The body doesn't operate like that and doesn't just all of a sudden create these autoimmune conditions. There's a reason for that. And the reason is, for these autoimmune conditions, there are these dysfunctional cells that maybe contain a lot more iron or just aren't able to keep up or maintain the metabolism due to that excess iron or lack of copper or lack of magnesium, right? So it's autoimmune conditions or immune conditions in general aren't this immune system issue that the immune system is bad. It's looking at what are those pieces that are allowing the immune system to respond in that way.
So I think you've done amazing today. I think what really resonates with me, though, and I think what people like about following me so much is that we've had an experience and we've used food to recover from that experience. But the question that people always come up with when they sort of are unpacking their story, because everybody wants it to be one thing, right? There was one thing that made me sick, and if I could just fix that one thing, then everything would be good. But it's never one thing. It's an accumulation of many things. And so I think for a lot of clients, there's this point where you have to go, not have to, but a lot of people will go, oh shit, I did this to myself. Or and obviously you can't control if you grew up in a stressful environment like I did with, a lot of abuse and trauma and stuff going on. That's going to elevate your stress response and can be the start of this cascade of things. But do you look back and say, oh shit, I did this to myself? How do you deal with that? Because now you're taking insulin forever, and you lost your identity as an athlete. How did you go through the process of, what does that feel like? What was your self-talk like, and how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think that's hard to cope with when you have that realization that, oh man, I probably did some things here that probably led to where I am here today. And, that takes a certain level of ownership and a certain level of awareness to be able to do that, because it is easy to blame external circumstances or genetics or whatever might be the case for you on that particular thing. And of course, those are certain variables. I certainly don't want to discount that, but there also is a certain ownership that you need to take for the things that might have contributed to that. And that's the power of reflection. That's the power of logging or creating that awareness for yourself, or working with somebody who has been there or can guide you through that process based on what they see there as well. And for me, there was a lot of negative self-talk, because I think, and this is something that my clients really related to too, is that when you get diagnosed with something, there is a lot of self-blame. And for me, there was, especially with my type 1 diagnosis, like, wow, what did I do here? What did I do to cause this? And that's hard to cope with. But the way I always approach things, especially if it's in a negative sort of light, is looking at what's the flip side here. What can I do that is ultimately going to make the best out of this situation? What can I learn from this? And as I start to reflect and work with people like Josh and connect with great people like you, it's like there are certain things that I didn't do in the past, or was overlooking, or was not supporting myself in a way that was healthy. And I can certainly admit to that. But what I've learned is I can take that experience, I can learn from it, and I can pass it on to others that might be in that very same situation, so I can maybe better support them, so maybe they don't have to go through something like I did before, right? So I think that's what I kind of take gratification with, is that I can take my experience and I can share that with others, and hopefully to some extent that helps them out go through that tougher period of time. Because when it comes to maybe the things that you felt like you did wrong, if you knew better, you would do better. And, once you do learn some things and advocate for yourself and get out there and look into educated people like yourself, Layla, I think you start to put those pieces together. So I think that taking away a little bit of that self-blame and understanding that, hey, if you only do the best that you can with the resources that you have. And that's what I did. But at the same time, learning from that, what can you take away from that as well? So that's how I personally have approached it.
And I think as well, like the medical industry, like I'm sure when you got diagnosed with type 1, they would have given you like the food pyramid and said you need to eat a certain amount of grain product as your carbohydrate. So they would say, well, you need to balance your blood sugar with protein, fats, and carbs, but they're telling you the wrong carbs to eat. So you get a diagnosis and there isn't the right support there to help you with that diagnosis. So we don't have any other choice really except to go on this journey to discover. And we also, I think, need to have patience with the fact that the industry, so you go from medicine, you go, well, I don't want to do that because that doesn't sound right. But then you go to wellness and it can just be as the same as allopathic medicine, where we just keep taking a supplement for each ailment that we have. And then we can go, well, I could try the dietary route where I give up sugar, or by the time you get to this place where you're like on a path where you feel like you're getting better, you've tried so many things. And I think it's having patience for the fact that there's just an overwhelm of information and we're not taught the simple, basic things at school. Like, I'm still surprised how many children don't know that a potato chip is made from a potato and what a potato looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. We can only go as far as our best support. And when it's not maybe up to par, or where we maybe need it to be, again, that's where the advocating for yourself can be such an important thing. So it's good to have maybe some level of support there, but I always recommend, taking that with a grain of salt, making sure that you're doing your due diligence, aligning with professionals that you feel would be supportive to you in your journey, and always continue to learn. Having that open mindset and understanding those basics can kind of go a long way in reducing some of that overwhelming, reducing some of that confusion. So that's where I always recommend starting, looking at and honing in on those basics, because as you said, that those are not so common anymore.
And I think it's also more and more regular that it's happening, that it's actually like a stressful event or a burnout kind of scenario where people are having these situations as well. So, and taking responsibility or owning that you pushed yourself too hard and you didn't stop and rest enough, that's a hard one in a society that's all about pushing yourself to the nth degree, academic achievements, financial achievements, not, oh, I ate all of my food today and I, that's not an achievement. Right. So I'm so grateful that you came onto the show, Isaac. I know there are going to be people listening who would love to work with you. How can they find you? How can they get in touch with you? What kind of programs do you offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So my main source of content that or my main channel rather, is my Instagram channel. It's just my name, Isaac Pohlman, at Isaac Pohlman. So you can look me up there. I also have a website, www.isaacpohlman.com, where you can download a free insulin resistance report. Actually, I did a whole report on that, so feel free to download that. There's also a link on my website where you can click on to work with me as well. There's a short little application there. So I have a few different programs or options that you can choose from. It's called the Balanced Blood Sugar Roadmap. So very on theme for today, and have a few different options there to choose from. So to get clients on the call, I often do like a short discovery call just to learn more about them and seeing if I can help. So feel free, if you're interested or want to look further into some guidance around blood sugar balance, feel free to schedule a call there.
And you have a book coming out?
I do. It's in the process of being edited. I have most of the content finished, but it's just a matter of putting it together. I'm sending it off to an editor. So hoping to have that done around June 1st or so.
Make sure you're on Isaac's Instagram or his mailing list so you know that when that book comes out, because I know there's going to be a lot of you listening going, oh my God, I have blood sugar handling issues, even if you're not diabetic or I'm pre-diabetic or those kinds of things. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Isaac. I've really enjoyed this chat with you, and thank you for all the information that you've brought for our guests today. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the invite, Layla. It was fun to be on with you.
I'm Layla Lutz, and you've been listening to The Body Never Lies. If you haven't yet, please go to your favourite podcast app and subscribe, rate and review this podcast. All the resources and references from this episode are waiting for you on my website, leelalutz.com. Just click on podcast and look for this episode. Now join me next week for another episode of The Body Never Lies. Thank you so much for listening.